Welcome to Bespoken Bones with your host, Pavini Moray, connecting ancestors, sex, magic and science. Pavini explores transpersonal tools for erotic wellness every new and full moon, engaging educators, healers, spiritual leaders and scientists in revolutionary dialogue. Get ready to feel good and go deep. This is Bespoken Bones.
Hi, and welcome to Bespoken Bones, Ancestors at the Crossroads of Sex, Magic, and Science. We're healing trauma, connecting with our roots, and developing radiant erotic wellness in past, present, and future generations. And I'm your host, Pavini Moray. So it's been great to be getting your feedback about the podcast, suggestions, support, questions. It's lovely to hear how the show's landing for folks. And it's also nourishing for me personally to know that it's having impact. So just wanting to say hi to Susanna and Oliver. Thank you for reaching out. So the contact form on bespokenbones.com is the way to be in touch. Would love to hear from you. And today I am so happy to introduce you to Christos Galanis. Christos is a Greek-Canadian transplant currently living in South Devon, England. His MFA in Art and Ecology from the University of New Mexico was spent exploring interspecies research collaboration with rescued donkeys. He's currently completing a PhD in human geography from the University of Edinburgh, where he is researching colonial walking practices and pre-modern relationships with mountains and ancestors in the Highlands of Scotland. His artistic and academic work centers on animist qualities of embodied relationship through movement, ritual, and artistic practice. Christos is passionate and excited for exploring the potential for critical somatic practices as tools for decolonizing relationships with land, body, ancestry, and sexuality. He's been teaching classes and workshops across Europe and North America for over 10 years related to the decolonization of walking, ecosexuality, shame, and colonization. Hi, Christos, and welcome.
Hey, Pavini. Thanks for having me.
So good to have you here. So, as I said, I'm really not sure what a cultural geographer is, which is what you are doing. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. If it's around, my guess is that it's around belonging to the land and understanding the land in different ways and the practices around that. So would you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. So when I was looking for PhD programs, the most obvious ones were anthropology programs. And the more I looked at them, I realized that it's still a quite disciplined field and quite steeped in kind of imperialistic epistemologies or ways of producing knowledge. And coming from art school, essentially, I found is probably going to be a challenge to do what I wanted to do within such programs. And so I ended up asking around to see, what programs might actually be a good fit. And what was suggested several times was cultural geography, or it's also known as human geography. And basically, it's considered the discipline without any discipline is kind of what it's called, because what you're essentially dealing with is time and space in its most broad forms. And so within that, it's allowed me to have quite a free hand in the kind of research that I'm doing and the kind of methodologies that I'm using. But essentially, it's similar to anthropology, except you're grounding your research in land and in geography, in place, rather than simply as kind of like a human-centered, detached world, I guess you could say, which is what anthropology tends to do.
Okay, so I think what I hear you saying is that it is around humans and humanity, but it's also holding that with a broader context of the land's cultural, geographical land features. Like, I'm imagining it's things like the stories that are held within the lands around, sacred places and stories around those. Am I getting it?
Yeah, and it's this idea that that quote, the land and humans, or nature and culture, are not separate, and that each inform one another and of course are entangled within one another. So what I do is I'm looking at landscape through walking, and the idea of landscape not as an object out there that you study, but the idea that landscape is a medium, and it's a medium through which we produce culture, and which also produces culture in terms of how the land informs us and defines us. And so my approach to it is to erase the separation between the land and between humans, and to consider us part of the land in itself.
It's interesting because you were asking me right before we started the interview itself, like what my interest is in doing these podcasts, and I was just talking about belonging and how I see orphanhood as a wound that we can directly have impact on through practices of belonging. And just wanting to share with you that I had this vision one morning fairly recently of the lands like rising up and taking a human form and then falling back down and melding again with just the earth. And then again, like just waves of like the earth rising up into human form and then melting back down into the earth and then rising up into, like, we are the land, right? And so I'm just curious, could you speak about that, like that, how can we practice belonging, the somatics of land and our bodies, and like realizing that we are earth, we are water, like we are made of these elements, and how can that address this belonging wound?
Yeah, that's a huge question because, I mean, a lot of my research is centering on this question of belonging, and there are many different critiques and celebrations of belonging. Some of the critiques, of course, are the idea that there are a people who intrinsically and for all ages belong to a certain place. And of course, that can manifest into a lot of atrocities, for example, in terms of politics over belonging. And I think most conflict zones in the world you can probably trace back to ideas of conflicting groups vying for a sense of who belongs to a place or which ways of living belong in a place. I know the kind of sense of belonging that you're talking about and many of our colleagues are talking about is perhaps not so rooted in a like physical geographical sense of land as property. So the idea that something belongs to you, but the idea that we belong to the land. So of course, what I'm dealing a lot with is this, what I'm seeing as a rupture between modernity and pre-modernity, where I think most cultures in most places in the world for most of the time have lived in a world where they perceive themselves to belong to the land. And of course, in contemporary Eurocentric culture, we tend to see the idea of land belonging to us. And so what I'm arguing for is an idea of belonging that is not based on, of course, property or the idea that certain people intrinsically belong to certain places for all eternity, but that belonging is conjured through practice and obviously through embodied practices, and that the way we relate to a place over many, many, many generations is in itself what gives rise to the feeling of belonging to a place. Because as you said, you spend long enough in a place and your bones, your flesh, everything, your language is made from that place. And so I think your sense of the idea of humans or cultures rising from the land and then eventually dissolving back into the land is actually quite accurate in terms of how life on this planet has been for humans for most of history.
Yeah, I think about it like if the bones of my ancestors are in the ground, right, and the bodies of my ancestors are in the ground or have gone back to a different state of earth, and then my food is grown in the earth, right, and is nourished by the bones of my ancestors. And I'm taking a wide view on this, obviously, not so place specific, but at a broader view, like, I have this sense of like, I am being nourished through the bones of my ancestors, right? That the material that I'm taking into my body is actually my ancestors, right? And that's true for all of us, right?
Right.
And that practice of like really realizing that we are made, like I am made of the same stuff that my ancestors are made of. I'm like, so are you, like, that the raw elements that make up our cells and our bones and our viscera actually are the same, right? That have been present on Earth, because there's a limited amount of stuff that can actually make stuff, right?
Right.
So we actually are that stuff. And what happens when we start shifting our attention and our awareness to that idea of I am this earth. I am these ancestors. I am ancestors of everything, not just of human form, but of, all these other forms. I wonder what happens to our consciousness. And if you could speak to that, what your thoughts are about that. And if you could speak to that at all about, how do you hold that?
Yeah, no, it's a really rich topic, and it's taken me a long time to really understand that. I have to credit a certain amount of that understanding to a teacher that I've been studying with for years, which is Stephen Jenkinson, who's based in Ontario, and his teachings on belonging in land and ancestry. And it's a very physical, very direct understanding of ancestry and land and belonging. And part of my research has been looking at Canadians of Scottish descent as they return to the Highlands of Scotland and, go and walk in their ancestral lands and connect with their clan mountains or their clan glens where their ancestors, had once lived and are still buried. And one really important understanding of ancestry is that our connection to our own ancestors is not only direct through our bloodline, but goes through the plant beings and the animal beings of that land, that we live with and among. And so if you consider just stone, so I've been dealing a lot with stone and bone, of course, these two kind of hallmarks of ancestry. If you think of, in Scotland, let's say, where you have sheep and cattle primarily and cows, and if you spend time with these animals, you know that oftentimes they will have preferred rocks where they lick for minerals and salts and things like this. And that's why in captivity they have to be given, salt licks and things like this. And so if you can imagine that they're licking and ingesting, let's say, the mountain that you live on, and then if you eat those sheep and those cows, then again, the bits of mountain that they've ingested, now you ingest, that becomes your bones. When you die, your people bury you underground in that mountain, and your bones, of course, are what remain the longest. And so this cycle, literally, of, the mountain becoming plant, becoming animal, becoming human, returning back into the mountain, is, I think, what people are really trafficking in when they consider, why we use gravestones and why we use stone markers, this idea of memory in the landscape and things that change the slowest. And so there's a strong relationship between bone and stone and mountain and memory. And I think it reflects this understanding of the fact that these are cycles and that things do return back to the land, kind of rise from the land and return back to the land. And this idea that somehow we're disconnected from the land or disconnected from our ancestors is a very recent spell, I would say, within our culture.
And a lie.
And a lie, yeah. Or it's a story.
Yeah.
I don't know if it serves us very well or if it has ever served us. I mean, it serves certain things well, mostly resource extraction and treating these beings and these lands as objects to be extracted from. So it's served certain things. But I think as, many of us have always had a feeling in our gut somewhere, there's something missing, there's a disconnect somewhere. And I think that sense of homelessness in modern culture speaks a lot to what is this dual disconnect from ancestry and land. And in fact, I would say that the two are inseparable, of course.
I, in my early 20s, had the opportunity to live on some land. I lived for, 6 months. And the relationship that started to happen was that I started to do the right thing on this body of land because it felt like the right thing. Does that make sense? I wasn't able any longer to do things that were out of alignment with what was good for all of us. like the land, the plants, the animals,
Right.
me, right? Like I couldn't like, I mean, like littering would be an extreme example, but like there was a poison ivy plant right outside the door of my tent, and I couldn't move it or I couldn't take it out. I couldn't kill anything. Like it was just the sense of like everywhere I went, I was part of the land that was part of me, and so harming it would harm me, and that experience was very profound. And I think that's what you're talking about of when we open to this kind of practice of belonging, of remembering that we are part of and breaking that spell of separateness. It lights up our integrity. We're like, oh, like suddenly I just want to do the right thing, the thing that feels right, that's like underneath all the layers of what I should do, or
Right.
All that kind of bullshit, but like just really getting down to like a knowing, an embodied knowing of how is the right way to relate with this particular land mass. Yeah.
And Pavini, I'm curious, what informs that sense of integrity for you? For example, when you were camping in that place for a while, and this is what I'm always curious in myself and in other people, of what is almost like the compass, you know what I mean? Like what's the embodied compass that we can tune more or less into, that tells us, okay, what you're doing now, not good, like you said, and doing this feels good. And we can describe it as a feeling, but I'm really interested in kind of drilling down to see what's actually happening in the body, what's happening in our senses that that guides us.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. It because I think at first it was a mental piece, right? Of like, oh, that would be, not being ethical or not being integrous here would be not good in a judgment way, was my head. But then the felt sense of it, it would just be like it's always hard to put felt sense into words, but like.
Yeah.
Like a clear path all the way through my body, all the way down through the land, or all the way up from the land through my body, of like the unequivocal yes of beingness, right? It was just it was the most effortless, the most easy, like the path of least resistance, that felt sense of that, of like there was no struggle,
Yeah.
And it would have been a struggle to do the thing that didn't feel right. That was not in alignment, right? So it wasn't like rules or principles. It was just like going with the flow of life that was already happening. Like I was just going with it instead of having to make decisions about it from a head place. Yeah, that's the best I can get to. Thanks for asking. Yeah, I'm curious if you would. So you talk about ecosexuality. I also identify as an ecosexual, and really hold that ecosexuality is ancestral sexuality. And I'm curious for you how you connect those things. And maybe just for folks who don't know what ecosexuality is, if you could say a little bit about that, that would be great.
Sure, I can try to summarize it. I mean, there's some conflicting definitions or understandings of it. For me, it is expanding my sense of the erotic, expanding my sense and my experience of arousal beyond human-centered engagements or relations, if that makes any sense. And so it's, rather than thinking that, human sexuality is what sexuality is, and then we project that onto the landscape. Again, this idea of separation, right, between kind of the land and ourselves, or between nature and culture. The idea is that human sexuality itself is a manifestation of the land and of our ancestors, of course, because we're only here because our ancestors fucked each other. And that is, of course, this energy. I talked about stone and bone, but of course sex and sexuality is one of the other fundamental connections between ourselves and our ancestors, because that's how we are brought into this world in this form. And so for me, it's been a long time practice, actually, of going into the land, always alone, and opening myself up to energies or states of arousal that might be there. It's not so much me willing it, but rather it does feel like an openness, or just kind of opening to what might be there. And most often what does come is it's an indescribable sense of sexuality and eroticism that is not about getting off in nature, and it's not about objectifying nature. It's really resonating with the very energies of creation itself. And so, I mean, I've had experiences of one time in the Berkshires watching two hawks alighting on thermals. Have you seen them do that? Just kind of going around in circles slowly, kind of riding these thermal wind currents that kind of keep them up, and just almost like entraining myself with that rhythm of their circling, and through their bodies feeling the sense of like this air kind of rising up from the earth, and interacting with their outstretched wings, and having a sexual experience in resonance with that, which I don't even know if it's sexual at that point. You know what I mean? Like, it's something that goes beyond what we would consider sex. And I haven't actually thought that much about ancestors in terms of these kinds of relationships, but it's something I would love to integrate actually a lot more into an understanding of how we can connect with our ancestors and with ancestors of land through sexuality. And again, not creating this separation between human sexuality and the land, or between human sexuality and ancestors, and also being a bit less precious about ancestry and ancestors, and not, kind of pretending that we're just in church, and that there isn't any fluids involved in connecting with that which nourishes us.
One of the people who I interviewed about this stuff for my dissertation research talked about a practice, an erotic practice of going to the grave of a beloved who had died and there was a gravestone, and the person had their body buried in the earth, and having erotic experiences on the grave of their former person. And it speaks to a lot, I think, of what you're speaking of. And I get it that it's like taboo and a little bit edgy to name these things, that these are things that humans do. And because this person is saying it, this person is not the only person who's ever done this, right? Of like, how do we, like in what that person was saying, just hearing about like the memory, like the gravestone, the memory of the stone, right? The physical connection to the land, like being open to the sky, having the erotic energy exchange with the ancestors, like really beautiful. And, this is graduate level practice, right? It's not like, I think I want to be an ecosexual. Okay, I'm going to, it's like, but yeah, like I hear what you're saying about like the expanding the erotic to the more than just self or human connections in ways that are transcendent, of course, consensual, and that create just a wider experience of like what is possible when we start holding trees and the moon and the ocean as our lovers, right? What becomes like it's that, I think it's the same question that we were talking about before of like, belonging, right? Like, oh yeah, this is another way to practice ancestral belonging, right? Is with the elements of the world of which I am made.
Yeah. You just gave me a great insight to my youth, because I was goth for many, many, many years, and would often make out in cemeteries. And I'm realizing if I just frame it as academic research, then I probably could get funding to dress in black and go back to some of the cemeteries around Toronto.
That's so hot. And you were like an ecosexual goth in your youth. Yes.
Apparently. I'm realizing that a lot of the goth scene was like the only acceptable way as like a, disaffected 19-year-old to actually connect with some of these energies and these ideas. I wouldn't go back now, but at the time it is like almost like a leakage, something that can leak through into the kind of mainstream culture that you can access and connect to.
Yeah, and as well, I was also as part of that scene, which is sweet to connect with you on. But that connection between sex and death, right? That these are similar processes, birth and death, and that it's interesting how the disenfranchised youth often have insight into like the philosophical underpinnings of reality, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I'm really curious how and why we desexualize the dead so much in our culture. I mean, on the one hand, I can understand that there's a tradition of reverence and respect, but, as you said as well, I mean, there's nothing wrong if everything is consensual, and both parties or all parties are equally interested in these kinds of connections.
Yeah, exactly. And the big practice here is discernment, right?
Right.
Around discerning like what is good for me and what is a safe way to work with these energies. Yeah. Would you talk a little bit about sacred reciprocity? I definitely see it as a theme in your work and in my work. I think that there's this new age neo-pagan woo-woo blah blah thing of that has really had some negative implications for this idea of nourishment, connecting with earth as a form of nourishment and reciprocating, like the receiving and the giving back, the receiving and the giving back. And so part of how I hold it is in a really practical, pragmatic way of this is a real thing, guys. We oughta, this is a really serious practice and concept. And I just wonder if you would talk about sacred reciprocity. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious, just for clarification, when you say sacred, what does that mean for you in terms of phrase sacred reciprocity?
It's something that came up out of my dissertation research, and I think it's really discerning it from transactional, right? That there's a way that the giving and the receiving are holy, that they our awareness of them as holy is part of the nourishment of them, and that there's not a sense of obligation, but there's a sense of choosing to be in right relationship, certainly, but also in the reach around, the give back as part of receiving life. So that's why sacred.
Okay. So almost like that is life itself, that is the nourishment of life itself rather than...
Yeah. God pouring God into God. Yeah.
Yeah. I think having not only been goth, but being part of kind of contact improv dance scene for many years and kind of being around a lot of, let's say, new age scenes. And there's a lot, the word, I just read it this morning, the word abundance, this idea of abundance and how abundant, Mother Nature is. And this idea that, we get stuff and then we somehow have to be good in exchange for the stuff that we're getting. And I'm assuming that's what you mean by transactional relationships.
Yeah,
this idea
exactly.
that we take stuff and then, we got to do something to kind of make up for it. And I've been addressing this specific thing in some of the workshops I've been teaching where I've been involved in the touch and play scene for a while now. And one of the central tenets of that, of course, is consent. And one of the tools that we've been working with, some of your listeners might be familiar with Betty Martin's Wheel of Consent. And she's an amazing educator on sexuality and intimacy and consent and communication. And she's developed a tool for analyzing what she identifies as 4 qualities of relationship. And that was a big one for me because it's not only taking and giving. It's the idea of I give you something to nourish you, and then you receive that from me to be nourished by. But also the idea of taking and surrendering, which doesn't happen so much outside of romantic relationships. But the idea that let's say if you and I were lovers, that I might want access to your body for my own pleasure, for my own enjoyment, not necessarily to give you pleasure, but from the sheer enjoyment of exploring and playing, with who and what you are with your body. And that idea that for that to be in consent, you have to surrender. You have to surrender access. You have to surrender your boundaries and allow me to take pleasure, to be nourished by accessing your being. And when we analyze these 4 qualities of relationship, I realize that when it comes to the non-human and even our ancestors, we're out of consent in all 4 of those quadrants for the most part in our culture. And so what I've been now doing is teaching people how to, facilitating relationships with the non-human and with ancestors where we actually use those 4 types of relationship and consent as understanding the different ways that we interact with the non-human or with ancestors. And that goes beyond, like you said, a simple transactional relationship where it's simply giving and taking, but the idea that how do we know how to listen when nature or, the non-human wants to take pleasure from us, for its own pleasure. And that might look like, wading into a river up to your knees and just spending time and letting the river itself, kind of splash against your calves, against your shins, against your flesh, to go around you, to interact with you, and to know that simply allowing your body to be accessed in that way can give pleasure to the non-human. So it's the idea that nature, the non-human, is not simply like a giving machine, and our job as humans is to take. And of course, it's always good to expand that and to consider that through ritual, through ceremony, through offerings, we can, of course, nourish the land and our ancestors and the non-human, but that there are even more qualities of relationship available that go beyond a simple giving and taking binary.
I think I have a cultural geography thing.
Sure.
As you're speaking about it, it just came up. Maybe it's not actually human. So, yeah. But I think I have an example of what I'm understanding. There are these palm trees on Mission Street in San Francisco, which is kind of weird and random. Right. But I can see them out the window, and so they're really tall and they're really like spindly, almost like palm trees are, like just long trunk, and like nothing's going on for miles, right? It's just like the trunk, and like looking out on this like super urban landscape, like gritty urban decay. This is not like it's like it's rough a little bit, and so I'm looking at these palm trees out the window, and I can see the wind moving through their fronds, mm-hmm. And I'm like, oh, that's so beautiful. And I'm just kind of watching it, like how the wind is caressing the fronds. And I'm like, I don't know anything about palm trees, and I don't know why they've evolved the way they have, but like, that's a really interesting shape for them to evolve into, right? And I'm like, oh, I think that they are allowing the wind to know itself through their body.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's what's going on there. Like, they're giving the wind something to know itself through and to be caressed through. Mm-hmm. Right? They're not taking from the wind. They're giving their whole beingness to the wind. I mean, and they have their own palm tree agenda, what they're doing, their purpose and stuff like that. But like, there was this like the non-human giving to the non-human. And the wind, of course, giving back. So is that, am I kind of in the right ballpark?
I think it's a great example, and I think it's a radical shift to think of pleasure and play and arousal being a fundamental ground in being itself, in evolution itself, in relationship itself. And I think another place that we get really wrapped up in our human-centered experiences, this idea of taking and surrendering, the idea that, the palm trees might have evolved that way partly because the wind takes pleasure in passing over and through those leaves in that way, and maybe that interaction between wind and palm tree has evolved in such a way that both these beings take pleasure from the way they interact with each other. And just looping back when you mentioned about sex and death, so arousal and death, ultimately the big surrender and the big take on the part of the non-human, of course, is with our own death, our inevitable death, and the idea that it's not that death is not something outside of life or something that disrupts life, but that death is the ultimate surrendering to life and allowing the land and allowing our ancestors to take pleasure in our being, our ultimate being, and to reintegrate us back, in form into themselves. And that from that side, Stephen Jenkinson talks about this beautiful image where when we lose someone, when someone dies, the kind of longing that we have when they die, you have to imagine that the longing on the part of the land and the ancestors when we're born, the idea that we are incarnate and not integrated as fully into our ancestors and the land, that they long for us and are yearning for our return, and that when we die, it's this fulfillment of this longing and being brought back into this fold. And so it's a very different way of thinking of death as well, and thinking of death from a non-human perspective as something deeply not only nourishing but pleasurable and playful.
Yeah, the giving, the surrendering of our body to our lover, the earth, as our final act of pleasure. Yeah, that's gorgeous. Wow. Christos, it's been so amazing to have this conversation with you, and just wanting to extend gratitude and blessing to you for the gift of your time today.
Great. Thanks, Pavini. It's been a really rich conversation. I know we could go on for quite a while. And no, I just appreciate these threads and these bridges that you're making, because I don't see it a lot, to be honest, to be out there connecting, queer culture and sexuality and ancestry and death and all these things. And it's conversations that I really value and I think need to be had more. And I thank you for having them and for inviting me to be part of it.
You're welcome. And thanks to everybody who listened to this episode. My intent is, and my deepest hope is, that it has been in service to the healing of you and your people and culture. And if you have felt inspired by what you heard, it would be great to hear from you. You can check out my other website, which is trancestralhealing.com, and you can learn more about the sexual and ancestral wellness work that I offer in private practice. I also facilitate monthly ancestral healing circles in the San Francisco Bay Area. So yeah, just be in touch. So ancestors of place and ancestors of blood and ancestors of lineage, thank you for your participation in this conversation today. We're grateful to get to be guided by your wisdom. I'm Pavini Moray, and I'll be back every full moon and new moon with more embodied goodness and ancestral wisdom.